Cameron, thank you so much for joining me. It's been several months now since April 2nd, 2025, and the big reciprocal tariff announcements, switch to other kinds of tariffs, and a new set of tariffs now, particularly for countries like India. So, if you were to look back at the last few months, what's changed and what's not?
I think what's changed is we've seen kind of an end to the post-World War II global trading system. What we knew just a few months ago is now completely different. I wouldn't say it's every man for himself in terms of trading, but what you've basically seen is the U.S. blow everything up and actually force countries now to collaborate together where they wouldn't have before.
Okay. If you were to look at industries in specific, and I'll give you a little background to this. So, for example, I was talking to someone in the apparel industry or representatives of the apparel industry a few weeks ago. I think many of them were expecting things to even out, some solution to be found. And I'm guessing that must have been the case or would have been the case with industries or companies world over. Like people were thinking that, Trump will come to his senses, so to speak, and then we'll have some kind of return to the old order, but that's not happened. So one is, I think, would you feel that companies maybe have lost time in this period? Secondly, whether they've lost time or not, what are they doing today? And is that sufficient?
Yeah, I think to your point, the assumption that cooler heads will prevail and that a more economic friendly environment will be created have essentially not happened. It's actually politics, national security. That's what's now driving the bus, and businesses just kind of thrown by the wayside with that. I think to your point, what you're seeing businesses now doing is they are starting to wake up of, oh, now I actually do have to have more contingency plans. And maybe their contingency plan actually was for a war or maybe a pandemic, but nobody really had contingency plans for broad scale tariffs globally. And so you are seeing companies that were waiting, I'd say up until maybe just even the summer, to hopefully there'll be some trade deals. Hopefully a few things will get moving so we can move forward. You did see a bit of that out of Europe, Japan, and Korea when they signed the agreements with the US. But ultimately, um, businesses were waiting for that. Those that have not had success in that, think of India as an example, Brazil, are really stuck. And so you are seeing businesses try to play catch up a bit. Now we have to move our markets to somewhere else. Now we have to figure out how do we deal with the tariffs in the U.S. And all this is kind of thrown things into chaos, where you do get a mix of companies that did have plans or were able to be more nimble, and companies that are now trying to play catch up and are behind in the market.
So I'm going to come to what the second order effect of all of this could be in a moment. But tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you've been in manufacturing. You set up a carbon fiber manufacturing factory in China, and that gave you the insights and understanding of how supply chains work. And then you got interested in it enough to now advise other people.
That's right. I mean, I'm originally from the U.S., but I went to China at the age of 19, basically for a year and never left. And so, a lot of my journey in my career has been primarily outside of the U.S., in China to some degree, East Asia, and now with supply chains all over Asia. My remit is essentially from the Middle East to Japan to Mongolia to Australia. So I cover most industries all over the continent. And to your point, yeah, it's been fascinating because I've also seen the evolution of how manufacturing has evolved and supply chains have evolved, particularly in Asia. Manufacturing 25 years ago was, you have some machines and you make products, and then you put it onto send it to the next guy, and then they will use it as part of their input, and it kind of goes down the chain. Now we don't see that anymore. Now we see an actual comprehensive supply chain where it's not just suppliers, but it's also governments, it's logistics firms, it's infrastructure plays. All of this is now working together. So these concepts of supply chains and integration have actually evolved quite rapidly over the last 2 decades.
And if as you come to the present today, I mean, would you say that things are now so embedded, as people say? I mean, and you've yourself argued that it takes 15 to 20 years to set up the ecosystem for most manufacturing systems. Or do you feel as you stand here and look ahead, uh, the timing and the speed at which, let's say, new manufacturing capacity can be created, supply chains can be set up, is there any hope?
It does take quite a long time to have, supply chains develop. You can set up a factory and a manufacturer in just a couple years, but that doesn't mean you have the electricity access, the raw material access, the people, and so on. So one of the things we've seen, how do you accelerate that process? But one way countries have done that, and companies, is they try to replicate what they have somewhere else. So, for example, Chinese firms when they went out of China, particularly Southeast Asia, they tried to replicate what they had in China in Southeast Asia. So they would call their supplier and say, "You're supplying me this in Shenzhen. You now need to move to Ho Chi Minh and supply me the same thing." So essentially, you saw this replication, and companies moved together. So supply chains evolved that way. And actually, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. When you're all in it together and you can co-develop and you're solving problems rapidly, you actually see you can accelerate that process. The challenge becomes when you have different barriers. Maybe you don't have enough infrastructure, for example, power. Maybe the government support isn't there. Maybe you just don't have the workers. So there are ways you can accelerate that process, but generally it's safe to say that supply chains, an effective supply chain probably takes a minimum of 15 years to build out effectively.
Right. And the move from China to some of these neighboring countries, including Vietnam, was driven also by tariffs in some ways, isn't it?
That's correct. Originally, there were some companies that moved, Adidas and Nike, for example, because the labor cost in China was continually increasing. But after when Trade War 1.0 was launched and all the tariffs came in, you saw companies en masse moving to Southeast Asia. It's kind of like a balloon. If you press the balloon down in one area, it'll rise in another. That's essentially what we saw. And that's why you see a replication of a lot of these ecosystems all around the region, is because as that happened, everybody was affected by the tariffs. It wasn't just foreign firms or Chinese firms, everybody. And so they had to figure out how do we replicate that and ultimately insulate ourselves. So that was ultimately the creation of the China Plus One strategy, right? A primary manufacturer in China, secondary facility somewhere else, particularly Southeast Asia, maybe Vietnam. And you have seen some capacity stay in China. For example, high-end products, because the ecosystem, but also the technology, the know-how, and that hasn't moved. What has moved is more the lower end, but also products that maybe we're not so sure about, right? Maybe the cost is the cost is variable. So how do we move forward with that? Well, we're going to set it to Vietnam, where we know the pricing structure is already low. So if there is an issue with it, and we can't make it for some reason, it won't affect our business overall.
Right. And looking at it from the standpoint of countries like India now, areas where India faces the most threat, because only about half is tariffed as of now. Electronics is not tariffed because Apple has a side deal. Pharmaceuticals as a sector is exempt right now. We don't know what will happen later, but it's exempt right now. But the industries that are really affected are gems and jewelry, apparel, leather, and these are all very labor intensive. What would you say, or how do you think manufacturers should be looking at their future right now?
I think one is, what products do we know that are constantly ordered no matter what? And I mean, are there sweaters or different styles that every year, for example, we know at Diwali you can order, right? And companies and businesses, for example, retailers, can support those small businesses by putting in long-term contracts. Hey, we know every year we need 25,000 of these. We're willing to put in half an order now. So you have that stability, you have that runway. Part of the challenge overall with businesses, what's my runway look like? What do my orders look like, not just today, but 6, 12 months from now? Um, and other things, you can upgrade machinery that doesn't quite help with some of the labor cost, right? And I think ultimately as well, banks need to be a little bit more friendly to small enterprises, whether it's through bridge financing, or if companies do want to expand or they do want to try to innovate, the banks are a little bit more or a little less conservative in understanding that and helping businesses get access to that financing when they could do that.
And you feel that people should be going back to basics in some ways. Acquiring land, figuring out all the infrastructure, and actually setting up some of those components to those supply chains. In this case, let's say apparel.
Potentially, I think one of the things is, where's your raw material coming from? If you have a local source of raw material, it makes it much easier. Are the threads made here, and how is the cotton processed? And when you have access to that, you actually have more flexibility. You can also do just kind of a JIT, just-in-time production method, so your cash flow is improved. Um, you could get land, you could buy machinery, you could upskill, but that also comes with the risk. If you don't have that runway, or you're not talking to your customers and saying, "I'm going to put this new capacity in to make this new product. Are you interested? Can you put in a pre-order now that if I start making it, you'll take order?" These are some of the things how you can buttress some of those effects. Companies generally don't do greenfield investments or build out unless they have some runway or some visibility ahead. And this is one of the things we're seeing, particularly in those industries, leather, apparel, carpets, for example, jewelry, is that we don't know what the runway is. So it's very difficult for them to maneuver. And that's why I think some of the banks can be a little less conservative at the moment to help companies get through this, and also allow companies to really talk with their customers and suppliers to figure out how are we going to maneuver here? How do we actually make this work? Because if I go out of business, you're also going to lose business. So let's figure out how to make this happen.
And as you talk to suppliers and vendors around this region, are you getting a sense that they are now in better control of what's going on, or is there still panic? And what are the kind of reactions you're getting?
Yeah, I think it's mixed reactions. On the one hand, there is panic because we don't know if there's going to be more tariffs, if there's going to be less tariffs. Also, that now that we have to look for non-U.S. markets, what does that actually look like? Well, the products that the U.S. takes, well, Europe now take that, or the U.K. I understand, Europe and the U.K. are negotiating with India on potential trade agreements.
India and UK already have one just now. Yeah.
Um, so will they take the same products? And if they do, then part of the problem is solved. Then you can just kind of quietly shift your focus to other markets. I think businesses can also look at what tweaks can I put um, into the product to actually make it more favorable to other markets. The U.S. market is a very unique market. Sometimes their tastes are not what everybody else wants. And so for the biggest bang for the buck for the local business, it really is looking at where can we ship these products to other markets? And at the same time, are there tweaks we can make it, maybe a different design or different color of this particular sweater, as an example, that can ultimately open up a whole wide array of potential customers to us.
And do you feel India has opportunity at this point of time to benefit from this in any way? And if so, what would that be?
I think the benefit to India is that now it's very clear that the U.S. won't do what's in your best interest and won't help you either, right? And there is an argument to be said that countries always behave in their own best interest, but they do help others from time to time. I think it's actually a blessing in disguise that this has happened because the India-China relationship can hopefully become a bit better, and through that, Indian firms can actually access more technology and raw materials that will help fuel their growth. At the same time, Chinese firms want that stability of ordering. With the U.S. tariffs, it becomes more difficult. Southeast Asia, to some ways, is more mature. There's less manufacturing maneuverability there. So if you're a Chinese firm and you have technology, you have machinery, you have different pieces and parts, your new growth market probably is India. So both sides now have this opportunity that would not have happened just a couple months ago.
And last question, I mean, and you've said this a little earlier as well, that a lot of Chinese companies are actually selling technology or willing to sell technology, which Indian manufacturers or potential manufacturers could buy. And an illustration of that.
That's correct. I mean, if you want today's technology, 2025, 2024, you probably won't get it. And this is actually a fear that the Chinese do have of we don't want people to have our technology and then it escapes us, right? We don't have control. But the technology of 2020, 2022 is all just sitting on the shelf. And particularly in certain industries, automotive parts, some electronics, even sporting goods, you do see technology that's readily available that the companies don't care. They're never going to use that technology again. But for some manufacturers, their technology is 1990. And so any kind of improvement can be done. I think the other thing, and depending how these contracts are worked, whether you do a royalty fee, right, for example, to the Chinese manufacturer for Chinese technology, or even if you just buy it outright, there is an argument to be said, pay more money, buy it outright, because then you can take it and fork it and make it indigenous to your own country and your own processes. We're seeing this a bit more in Europe than we are anywhere else in the world, where they are trying to get Chinese firms to bring the technology, but then fork it and make it more European. I think this is a potential model firms can look at. Regardless, I think the big picture is it's positive because the technology is available. Not in all areas. There will be some sectors that aren't, but everybody will benefit. The Chinese will be able to make money off of the technology. The Indians will be able to get it and continue to advance their build out of manufacturing and supply chains.
Cameron, it's a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.